For the technical hassle, everybody. Uh, Today we had an issue with our Twitch account being locked.
Yeah.
So we need to do some kind of
Today we had an
arrangements
issue,
about
with
that. But
our
anyway,
Twitch account being
welcome to the
locked.
first Expa meetup
we
of
need
the
to do
season.
some,
I'm Wanda O'Reilly, your
kind of
hostess today.
And
about
that, but
This meetup, just like
welcome
all
to the
our
first
meetups, are
Expa
brought to
meetup
you
of the
by
season.
our
I'm
DG
Wanda
and Game
O'Reilly,
Center
your
partners,
hostess
which
today.
are the Uni of
And,
Applied Sciences Jyväskylä,
this
Business
meetup, just like
Jyväskylä,
all our
Jahaha,
meetups, are
Fingersoft,
brought to you by
DeskMe,
our DG and
Seltimil,
Game Center
and
partners,
Keski-Suomen
which are the
konttoripiste.
Uni of Applied Sciences
Now,
Jyväskylä, Business
I see
Jyväskylä,
some new
Jahaha.
faces in the crowd and hopefully online as well. So, just as a quick recap, what is Expa and what is this event that you are participating right now? So, Expa is an ecosystem operator in the game industry here in the central Finland. We try to bring together everybody interested in the game industry. That meaning entrepreneurs, professionals, teachers, students, researchers, you name it. Of course, hobbyists, anyone who is looking to learn more about how game development works and possibly land a job in the industry. And from your point of view, this meetup is very much about sharing information openly. So that's the beauty of the Finnish game industry. We're not sitting on our secrets, but we rather share them quite openly, because whenever we boost the success of Central Finland or Finland altogether, it usually benefits all the companies in the area. So this is very nice and a kind of culture that we wish to cherish. And as a kind of a statement to that, we host these monthly meetups where we always share top-notch information from the best of the industry. Now, as in all of our meetups, the Twitch stream is going on in twitch.tv/expajkl. And in the chat, you can place questions anytime during the presentation. So please, you don't have to kind of remember those, but just keep them coming during the speak as well. So I will fire them at our speaker afterwards. And of course, the more interactive and the more you have anything to share or ask, the better. So let's make it talkative and interactive in that sense. Now, about our speaker. He's quite something. What I could describe as a designer anthropologist, a man of culture, expert on culture and company culture. And he has studied and taught flow in the context of gaming and game development in great places like Supercell and Ubisoft. So again, as stated before, tonight you are in for a treat. Without further ado, the floor is yours. Estève Pannetier.
Kiitos paljon. Thank you very much, Wanda. Let's see if I can get this mic. Thank you. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. I've actually come from Helsinki today. I just wanted an excuse to get out of the office and travel all the way to the sunny north here. So thank you for having me. Today we're going to talk about flow. You know flow. You know about flow. You've experienced flow for sure when you've played video games. You've probably experienced if you play music. You've experienced that feeling of the time that sort of stands still. You get this feeling that you can play for hours and you don't see the clock. You get this energy, you get this boost, you get this hyper focus. Even without having ADHD, you get hyper focus in flow. You also get this feeling of motivation that's coming from within when you really get in the flow. And so flow is something that people know and talk about. It's not something very mysterious, but when I started looking into it, it just happened when I was working as an HR manager in a small creative agency in Helsinki. It was about like 9 years ago. I started really looking into it. By the way, if I speak too fast, just interrupt me. Yeah, because I tend to go really fast. And what happened is that all the creators were going, oh, I know flow. Yeah, I play video games, I know flow. Or I play music, I know flow. And I started looking at how do they actually use flow. And none of them were able to tell me how do they reach flow. All they could say is when they were in the flow. So I started developing a bit of measuring things to do that. And what you're seeing here is a simplified, obviously very simplified model of flow, which is taken from, let's see if I can get this right, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Anybody Hungarian here who can correct my spelling? No. I actually had a Hungarian who corrected it for me once and taught me how to say the name properly. It comes from this Hungarian psychology researcher who was in the 1960s studying the psychology of happiness. Now, if you've studied psychology, you know that most of the time psychology is about problems. And he was one of the pioneers of psychology of happiness. So how do you actually use psychology to feel good? And flow, he coined flow because he did hundreds and hundreds of interviews with people all around the world to see what is actually flow. How do they describe it? And he found that, you know, whether they were Eskimos or New York bankers, they all described flow with similar words. And they often said it's like going down a river. It's like being carried down a river and being in that state of relaxation and efficiency at the same time. So he called it flow for that reason. So that's where the flow theory originates from. I'm now talking about the psychology. I'm not talking about being in a work flow, which is a completely different thing. That's just about project management. I'm now talking about the psychology of flow. And we're going to talk about it in general terms, just so you understand how to measure it. We're going to talk about it in the context of games, like as a designer, how do you build flow into the game mechanic, into the game strategy, into the gameplay. But then we're going to talk about how do you hack your flow in team dynamics, because it's one thing to be in the flow alone at your computer doing your coding at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's another when somebody's screaming at you on the phone. How do you reach flow when you're in a conflict? You know, that's not the same parameters. And at the end, I just wanted to add a few myths that I've heard over the years about flow from different countries and leaders who start working with flow, and some like fallacies around flow. So the idea of today is to be really practical. Theory is only useful when you can apply it. So the idea of today is to make you walk away with something that you can use as a rule of thumb in your daily work as a team leader or as a team participant to actually get as much flow as possible. Okay, so that's the framing for today. Now, what is flow? Flow, I mean, of course, flow, when you look at the research, it's way more complex than 3 metrics. Okay, so just disclaimer here, I'm oversimplifying for the sake of today. But if you go down to the bottom of it, there's really 3 main components of flow. One is what I would call the perceived level of challenge. So let's imagine that right now we pick. Is there anybody who's feeling a bit brave and talkative today, other than Wanda? Anybody want to use as an example? Dmitry, thank you. So let's imagine that yesterday you were in a meeting. Were you in a meeting yesterday? Or some kind of teamwork, yeah? So we could use that and just walk through how to evaluate flow in a general sense, just to make it really tangible. First thing is, when you are in a meeting, there's a level of challenge that you perceive in that meeting, okay? Now, it's not the actual challenge, it's the level that you think it is, the perception of your challenge. So let's imagine that on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is really challenging and 1 is not challenging at all, how challenging was it for you to be in that meeting? Maybe between 3 and 4. 3 and 4, okay, so we could say 3 and 4, somewhere here. So that's your level of perceived challenge. The second thing that's really important about flow is the level of perceived competence. Some people use the word skill. There's a difference, but I think competence is more accurate. So again, it's your perceived competence. It's not your real competence. It's how you see your competence, which is actually good news. That's how you can hack into the flow. So yesterday, in that session, how competent did you feel to do your job on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not very competent? 8, okay, yeah, thank you. So 8, somewhere here. Now, the third thing that we added when we started measuring flow is something that's often invisible, called motivation, intrinsic, internal motivation. Okay, so why motivation comes into this is that without any motivation, you don't get flow. Even if you've got a good balance of challenge and competence, you'll never reach flow without motivation. So yesterday, on a scale of 1 to 10, how motivated were you to nail that meeting? 6, thank you for your honesty. Yep, so there we go, 6. So this is how it works. You've played battleships, I'm sure, like, you know, the XY coordinates. This is really taken, if you Wikipedia search flow, you'll find the 1988 octant model. This is the same model that I've just flipped 45 degree on the side to make it easier to work with. So what you'll find is that there's a few zones, which are generally, and this is not a real square. If anybody's really about geometry, they're gonna go like, this is not a square. This is supposed to be a square. So there we go. Let's just draw this up a little bit, and then, so roughly speaking, you've got some areas that you can land in when you take your numbers, okay? So first of all, this is the flow zone. That's the place where you want to be. That's the place where you get that energy, that motivation, that internal. Then you get the state of control. You have a state of relaxation. You have a state of boredom. And then you have a state of apathy. And right here, you have anxiety, not too nice. You have worry, and then you have arousal. There we go. So essentially, when you look at your feelings and you look at the numbers, you can have a pretty good idea of how self-aware you are. So let's imagine now in your meeting yesterday, based on what you said, 4.5, no, you said 3 to 4, that's about here. If we take the XY to about 8 here, plus 6 out of motivation. 6 is basically bringing you up towards flow. If you have less than 5 motivation, generally it drags you down towards apathy. So you probably yesterday were feeling a mixture of control, relaxation, perhaps a little bit of boredom and occasional flow. But you most likely were feeling in control in your meeting. Yeah. Yeah. So what happens with this is that it's not rocket science, but when you start looking at it like that, you'll notice that sometimes your feeling, the feeling that you have here, doesn't match the perception of the scores. And that is where it becomes really interesting, because that's a difference between your feelings and how you actually see yourself. And that's where you can actually hack your flow. And we're going to see how that works now with both game design and teamwork. But before I go there, are there any questions about this first bit? Yes?
I didn't quite actually hear what you said in between. I can't read that bit. I've done this with you now. On the left side, you've got flow at the top, and on the 90 degree, yeah, what's that word there?
Arousal.
Arousal, right.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people confuse arousal with flow, and they stay in arousal all the time. In fact, thank you for asking that, because that's prompted me to say something about the zones. We often hear this like, life begins on the edge of the comfort zone. Yeah, so this is the comfort zone here. This is the comfort zone, and you can stay in there when you have really high competence, high perceived competence, and not too much challenge. It's nice on holiday, but if you're working, it can very quickly get boring. Here is the challenge zone. Here is I call it the slow death zone, which if you stay too long in, you end up burning out, not good. And this is the flow zone, where obviously you try and aim to get as much as possible, but you cannot always stay in the flow zone, okay? So comfort zone, challenge zone, stress zone sometimes, flow zone, and slow death or burnout zone. So there we go. Now, that's basically the black theory around how this can be measured, and this can apply to anything. You can apply this to working in any industry. You can apply this to doing pretty much any activity. But in gaming, when I was working in Ubisoft, it was really interesting to notice how they used this kind of logic to build their game strategy. I was working with Assassin's Creed, Splinter, Far Cry, this kind of franchise. And basically you can use this to start thinking of how you design your game strategy. So let's look at how do you adjust the level. I'm going to put the game design. So this is the experience of flow for obviously the gamer, the end user who's playing the game, right? So any ideas of how you can sort of adjust the level of challenge in the game design? It's pretty obvious. It's an easy one. Come on. I'm almost ashamed of asking you that. Okay, let's put levels of the game. Okay, that's the starting point. So levels of the game. So you can start creating, your levels on the basis of perceived challenge. But you can also start looking at this side, level competence. What's that in game design? Skill? How could that be done in a game? Life points, superpowers, abilities. Okay, so lives, superpowers. What else? You know these. You know these better than I do. What else can you use to create different levels of competence? Sorry? New mechanics, yeah, yeah. Am I speaking close enough to the mic, Wanda? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And of course, my favorite one is the cheat codes, because I'm really bad, so I always use the cheat codes. That's the only way I could play SimCity. Pawn tips Gazzardo, my favorite cheat code. But basically, that's how you can hack this. And by the way, now if you apply that into your communication later, you'll see that it takes a different form. But right now, in game design, this is really where your comfort zone is. As if you're working with game design, this is pretty obvious to you, okay? The blue bit, game design. Motivation, what can you do for motivation? Yeah. Exploration, I think any reward, whether it's points, hidden treasures to find, motivation loops. Another sort of interesting one here is if you're playing multiplayer, the social motivation. So often in the games I was working with, that was basically given by the multiplayer aspects, like all the multiplayer mechanics.
Isn't it just player type says what the motivation is
Yeah.
for that player? So
Yeah.
you need motivation for that specific player type.
Yeah, and each player type are going to have different intrinsic motivations, internal motivations. Yeah.
When we talk about mobile games, perhaps it's good to add also monetary motivation.
Good point. So, yeah, external motivation, or it can also be partly internal. So that's basically like, now that's giving you like a mental model that you can easily connect to the game design topic. But now, this is where it starts to become, I think, more relevant for you today, is that's in terms of when you make the game experience flowing for the end user, and hopefully if you nail it, then they come back and play more and more. But now if you're designing a game and you're working on it and you've got your 73rd energy drink and you're literally shaking with caffeine or whatever, you might want to remember this, is that you actually can hack your team flow, your collective flow, right? And it's not going to be quite the same. So if we look at the level of challenge, your level of challenge, if you're looking at it from your work day, what can be changing your level of perceived challenge? I'll give you one, your goals, how clearly they are expressed, your OKRs if you use them, your timelines, your deadlines, your objectives. And generally what happens is that the less these are defined, the more it feels challenging. So here's an easy one. Every time you feel really stressed, it's probably because the goals or the timelines or deadlines are simply just not defined well enough. Because when you do that exercise as a team leader, if you're a scrum master or you're a team leader or you're running an operation, often when people start to talk about stress and worry, all it is just a lack of clarity about the level of challenge. What the challenge has been defined is too vague and too broad, and when you start making it clear, suddenly the perception of the challenge goes down. So that's the really cool thing about flow, is that it is not absolute. It is based on your perception. So that perception in 2 seconds can change. So you can go from being worried to in the state of flow in an instant. In fact, in some workshops, I've been running creative workshops for quite a few years. We do flow check-ins in the morning. We do a flow check-in at lunch with Post-its. You know, you can take this, put a Post-it where you are. Everybody is going to be in a different place on the map. And then you do it at lunchtime, and it's going to be another one because the caffeine hasn't kicked in from your lunchtime. And then in the afternoon, somebody's going to be really high in flow, and others are going to be in anxiety. So it's something that constantly changes. It's not something that you just are in the flow forevermore. It's happened now, but in 10 minutes it might change. So level of challenge in terms of game design or in terms of working, that can apply to any project, not just game design. What about competence? What can you do to change your perception of competence? Any ideas? Yeah? 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 How do you do that? Tools. I'm going to put in bracket power. Yeah? An obvious one is what development languages you code in. Like, what are your actual coding skills, for example? You know, if you have a very high ability in one, it obviously increases your perceived competence in some way. What else? Thank you. I was hoping somebody would say that. Yeah, feedback. You know, you can have at the beginning of a meeting, somebody who gives a bit of praise that's honest and genuine can literally change the perception of the whole team of being 5 to 7 in one sentence. And that's what good leadership is about learning to help people perceive their competence higher, even if they don't see it themselves. So if you're running a team, remember that it's just the perception, it's not their real competence that is here. And of course, there's lots of other things, like, for example, training. I do a lot of training, and for example, if I'm working, when we were working with Sion, we were working with communication training. So if, let's say that you have a conflict, often people in Finland, they avoid conflicts. They see all conflicts as bad, when in fact a creative tension is a form of conflict that's necessary. So if you train on how to manage a conflict, suddenly when a conflict comes, you don't get stressed. You might even feel flow and control just by the training. So training is another obvious way to hack your flow. This is so deceptively simple. You know, if you look at all these HR tools that they have where they measure happiness at work and everything, this is way more useful. I actually started using this as an HR manager in a creative agency, and you know, the feeling of happiness doesn't really help. Like, there's days up and down. But if you can actually understand where you are on this map, then it gives you a sense of how you're going to actually do your career. But it's no point training somebody who's feeling very competent and who's just not got enough challenge. This is a common mistake in team management, is that we think that everything can be solved by training people. Sometimes training is actually counterproductive. If they actually have a high perceived skill and competence, what they actually need is not tools and training, they just need a bigger, better challenge, okay? So one way you can do that in your daily meetings is by rotating your roles in a meeting. I think Wanda has a lot to say on that. They've been doing that for years. They've been using a system where different people are hosting or facilitating the meeting. When you facilitate a meeting, you up the challenge. So if you're bored, instead of sitting bored, you can actually do a little bit more harvesting, a little bit more facilitation in the meeting. It serves the collective and it helps you to get more in the flow. So there's ways like that that you can actually reach the flow just by understanding where you actually are on the flow map. Motivation. What in the context of teamwork, what would be motivation? Any ideas? Sorry? Rewards. It's going to be rewards, isn't it? Like, but it doesn't have to be bonus, monetary rewards. It can be, of course, but it can be also kudos, social recognition. You know, like employee of the month, gamer of the month, whatever it is. I'm working at the moment with a gaming company, and they have their gaming company that does actually music. So they have the trophy for the musician, and then suddenly that brings the motivation. So everybody has their own ways of doing that. So game design and teamwork are two ways that you can approach flow on this map. Any questions before I move on to something of the myths? Yeah. That's correct, and it's a theory, and like every theory, there's holes in it, and today the octant model has been replaced by a more complex model, but I think the octant model is quite useful for a quick rule of thumb evaluation. So let's imagine that you're in a state of apathy. You can still reach a state of semi-flow with hyperfocus. I've worked with people, for example, who are on the spectrum and who get into hyperfocus just like that. So they might feel similar symptoms to flow, but they might not be getting the motivational aspects of flow. They might just be getting the hyperfocus and the efficiency without the emotional reward of it, let's say. So the feeling that you see on this map is different than the actual numbers, which is why it's quite interesting to measure both, because when there's a difference, if you say, like if Dmitry said, okay, actually it's 4 to 3, 8, but actually I was feeling worried as a feeling, that would be a really interesting invitation for him to see how realistic is he perceiving the challenge, how well he's understanding the challenge, and it becomes a mirror for you to look at and see how you are actually in your team. Mm-hmm. So if we take the music is kind of, in a way, adding not necessarily a challenge, but an extra cognitive sense, and therefore cognitive load, which then slightly increases your cognitive challenge, and then helps you hack your flow. So that's a great hack, listening to music. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah? Low challenge, high competence. It's more about control. So you have gamer profiles who are control freaks, in a sense, who actually feel that the best thing they would experience is control, not flow. And there are people who are arousal freaks. I'm using the word playfully, right? But there are people who sit well in that zone, who get more out of that than the flow. Sometimes it's because they've never experienced flow. Sometimes it's because they actually don't want to be in that state of flow. They'd actually prefer the control. So that's where it's interesting to do your gamer profiles, because there will be people who are more on that side, and here as well. Any other observations or questions? Yeah?
I'm wondering where perfectionists go.
Where do you think they go? They could be anywhere.
I mean, it's a kind of two-edged sword. Like you're raising your challenge and you're downplaying your perceived competence, and then basically you're ruining your motivation by being a perfectionist. So how do you play that?
So without going to sort of changing a personality, which by the way, we now know that personalities are constantly evolving, whereas in the past we used to think the personality stays fixed. If part of the personality is actually being very, very self-critical and perfectionist, then obviously that person is going to find it harder to reach flow. So, then that becomes a question to oneself is, if I'm really perfectionist, does that perfectionism cost me a great energy and flow at work, and is it worth it? I'm a perfectionist. I definitely subscribe to that, where I always downplay what I think I can do, and therefore I end up more on the stress zone than the flow zone. And then obviously that's not so enjoyable. But I mean, anybody can go into flow once they understand how to do it. And that's the key thing here, that we often don't remember that flow is not something that's given, because if you design a game, it's easy to think that it's given by the game. But actually, at the end of the day, if you've really done gameplay analysis and look at how people play, they will do anything with your game, and they will do things that you would never imagine with your game to get the flow. So sometimes it's really interesting to do a game analysis on the basis of what are people doing which you hadn't planned them to do, so that they can reach flow. Now, I give an example. When we were looking at Assassin's Creed, and they were designing the Boston game plan with the open world around the whole historical setting of Boston, the game designers put a lot of attention into the details of the Boston historical streets, and the game was actually getting flow for some of them, and we found the subgroup of players who were 30-year-old history teachers. And these guys were like, they're usually guys, and they were like really, into the game, simply to walk around the streets to see the historical details. And they would actually even take screens and snippets for their students in class to show them Boston in that day. And for them, the flow was basically doing a historical excavation of Boston, and it had nothing to do with all the game mechanics that had been designed. So it's interesting to see also what people are actually doing to reach flow in the game, and learn from that, and maybe design that into the next version of the game. Any other? And it links to that and that, because your motivation, obviously, when you recognize something, you feel more connected to it. So there's a sort of effect on the motivation. But it also, if you know, for example, if I take Boston and you think of, the city and you've lived in it, then you feel more competent around walking around the city. So it also does a change on level of perceived competence. In your case, that might have been a... Mm. Exactly. Wonder.
If it's not too much requested, can you talk in a way that people online also understand what was the question from the audience? So kind of repeat the question.
Thank you.
In a way.
Yep. So flow, that's the basic, and I think I'm going to remove this or maybe put it on a side so that we can come back to it. We can come back to it. I'll just flip it over. So there was a couple of myths. So over the years when I've been doing workshops on flow, and I've done this not just in the gaming industry, I've done this also I remember once there was a group of Chinese and Korean managers who got really excited about flow, and I was in Alto Executive. We had this very corporate training, and they were all like taking notes, and they wanted like, what's the app to measure flow? And can you give me an app or something to measure flow? And I'd like to measure flow for my whole team. And obviously that doesn't work, because it's not about flow, it's about your perception. So everybody has to measure their own flow. Of course, you can still do a self-evaluation app. I've actually got a prototype for that. But the first myth about this, which I think is really worth noting, is that when you're measuring flow, you cannot outsource flow. In other words, you have to take responsibility for your own flow. And that's a fundamental in culture. Wanda and I have been talking about culture building in game design, and what happens often is that people tend to go into their office thinking, there's a bit of this like, I'm being looked after by my team, by my creative director, or by my boss, or by the company, and that in flow doesn't work. Because if people are outsourcing their flow to their leaders, the leaders can't read your mind and your feelings, and therefore they have no idea where your flow is. So the first myth is that flow can be managed from the top down. No, flow, I'm going to write this as a myth. So flow can be managed by creative directors or leaders. No, not possible, unfortunately. So cannot do. Basically, what you have to do is that you have to basically take an interest in your flow, and you have to take complete, as we call, I don't know if you've seen Jocko Willink, the Navy SEAL who turned speaker. He talks about extreme ownership, meaning that you take complete responsibility for your flow. So take extreme ownership of your flow will be one of the best things you can do for yourselves in your working life. Yesterday, I was building a cultural DNA for that company we talked about earlier with the music. That's one of their values that they're putting in for people they hire, is you have to be responsible for your flow. So that's one thing you can concretely do, is basically for example, every week you do team, okay, what's my flow and what are my needs to reach flow? I need more training. I need less challenge. The second fallacy is that, well, actually this started with my boss. So he was this super smart strategist. He used to work for IKEA family, and he built the whole IKEA brand. And I was in a creative agency, and he was very, very good at reaching flow alone. And what he would do is that the night before a presentation, he would basically take the last slides and start revamping them. Like 2 hours before the presentation, in the taxi, he'd be rewriting words. And he's loving it because he has a very high perceived competence. So he's like, I have a high competence perceived of 10, and I want as much challenge as I can get because I'm not going to get in the flow otherwise. So he was basically making challenge for himself and for his whole team, because he was the boss, just to reach flow. It was costing him, on average, once a month, a person would burn out and leave the company. And they had no idea why it was. And it's very obvious when you start looking at it, is that his flow was not the same as the collective flow. So fallacy or myth here is that my flow equals other people's flow. You'll notice that when you're in a meeting and it's like, my flow, for example, if you're feeling shit, it's very easy to assume that others are feeling bad. Actually, it might be that they're in the flow. They might just not even mention it. So collective flow and individual flow are not the same thing. There's a big holy grail search for collective flow at the moment. Nobody's really cracked it because it's so complex. But in practice, what that means is that don't assume that because you are feeling stressed or bored or flow, that others are feeling the same, even if their body language looks like they are. So ask, don't assume that others are the same, other people's flow. Which, you know, obviously means have a conversation about flow. It's not something that you can guess. So my flow is not the same as the collective flow. Third myth that I had, and these are taken from people who've tried and failed reaching flow. I've had this where people go like, okay, right, I've reached flow, done. I've done everything I need to reach flow. I mean, I'm a gamer. I know how to reach flow because I put my headphones on and I get flow. But you never reach flow. You always are in a constant evolution because your challenge is changing. Your level of competence is changing throughout your life. So what you need for flow is constantly changing. So it's not once and for all, it's constant change. So here what you can do about that is really just like keep measuring it, keep sort of asking yourself, what do I need for flow? And by the way, that will help you with conflicts because the seed of all conflicts is people don't express their needs. And it's a lot easier to talk about a need of flow than a personal emotional need. So if I say I need training, it generally is less triggering and conflictual than saying I'm having a deep existential crisis. Okay, so it makes it also easier to deal with work conflicts and keeping them non-personal and therefore creative and healthy conflicts, because talking about flow is quite safe. So that's another myth. Fourth one, I hear this a lot by people in Finland who like to work with asynchronous communication, meaning chat, Slack, and messaging. And often they say, yeah, but you know, I can't reach flow because communication just keeps breaking my flow, right? Well, guess what? You can hack that as well. So communication doesn't stop the flow or break your flow. What can you do about that? Now that you understand the flow, what can you do when it's communication, for example, chat, Slack? Muting is a good idea. Muting does help. Like, okay, I have a deep work mode. I've seen companies who have a rule that says when you're in deep work, you mute all your Slack. And it's okay to do so, and people expect you to do so, so that then you can manage your flow. That's one way you can do it. The other thing is actually you can use communication in a positive way with praise. You get into a meeting, everybody's tired, they've not had enough sleep, they're feeling a bit shit about their work or whatever it is, and you come in and you say, even though it was not optimum, there was a really great effort, and you start praising with genuine praise, you'll notice that the perception of competence is going to change. And with just a few words, you can get the whole group into flow. That's what, you know, the so-called American pep talk is about. It's also about hacking flow. So you can do things with communication. Last one is to do with feedback. Now, often people talk about feedback and they confuse feedback with complaining. You recognize that? So feedback is not complaining. Of course, you can complain, but generally feedback has three components, and it's really important to actually use them wisely when you're trying to hack your flow. One of them is, let's call it praise or reassurance. Like you've done your sprite, it looks pretty fabulous, and you just want people to give you a thumbs up. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with asking for positive feedback. In fact, we need that more than any of the other feedback, but we often don't dare to ask because we feel that, oh, I can't possibly ask for feedback that's positive. I have to ask for a build or an opinion or an advice. Actually, you'll find that 80% of what we need, it's like driving a car. Your feedback loop is like the speedometer. Imagine if when you would drive a car, you would not have a speedometer, you only have flashing lights and radar and police cameras flashing at you. You'd get insanely stressed. What you need is 90% of the time, you're just looking at your speedometer and going, yeah, I'm just under the speed limit. Yeah, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good. It's praise, it's positive feedback loops. Occasionally you get that orange flashing light that the brakes need to be changed. But if you only have the flashing lights, which in communication is advice or opinions, it gets really stressful. So when you're giving feedback, usually the thing that really helps is to not give feedback, but ask for feedback when you're ready to receive it, because that does two things. You're psychologically ready to receive it, you can digest it, and then it's on you to actually ask specifically, what do you need? Do you need an opinion, and therefore other people giving you opinions, expert and qualified to give that opinion? If I give a game sprite and a UI deck to somebody who's not a graphic designer, their opinion matters less than a graphic designer. So it's qualified advice is really valuable. So are they expert? And advice is very valuable when it's, again, somebody who's qualified. So in feedback, when you start using what I would call conscious feedback, by not giving but asking for specific opinions, advice, and praise on things that you need, generally what that does on your flow is that you start to actually really feel good about your work, because your challenge level goes down because you get advice on how to do it, and the praise helps you feel more competent, so it actually can literally shift your flow in a few moments of feedback. Hence why I often recommend that feedback and flow go hand in hand. Often what I do with games is that we work through a workshop, and at the end of the day we say, what's your flow? Where are you now, and what are your needs? And then feedback comes after that. So those are the 5 myths that I have heard countless times in the gaming industry, but also in other industries. But there's plenty of others, and I'm sure you have some now questions, and we can have a little bit of a conversation about flow. This is all I had to share on these flip charts. And because you highlighted, so the question in a way was, there's multiple levels to that question. One of the angles that is you can do some things as a leader, and but can you force it? Is that the question, or are you making an observation more than a question? So yeah, so that's an observation. Thank you. Was there a question as well? Thank you. But that's a really great observation, and I'll just add to what you said is that when this is a hot topic after COVID, going back to the office, can you force a person? Does it stop their flow? There's a dangerous thing in that, is that when we talk about flow, we often don't talk about the needs. So if we take that particular topic, which I've been working on for months, generally it's counterproductive to not address the needs behind staying at home. Because, I mean, there's a good reason why people want them in the office. It's not just to be annoying, in a sense. There's needs behind both sides. So in a conflict of work, where this is a big topic in many companies right now of hybrid work, like how many days in the office, how many days remote, what is often not spoken about, which is directly related to flow, is what are the unspoken needs around being at home, not at home. And once those topics are on the table, then flow is much easier to reach. Example, the need might just be for less public travel, public transport. The need might be a need to work in pajamas, and they don't want to talk about it because they're ashamed. The need might be a need for hyper-focus when they're easier to focus without the distractions. And a lot of those can be handled in the office if they're addressed as needs. So it's often not a question of home versus not home. It's a question of what's the need that hasn't been expressed and addressed by the collective. But that's another topic that can open up a whole new area of hybrid work. Any other observations or questions?
I think I had this comment that actually good leaders, they of course cannot manage it, but they can facilitate it in not only by counting for needs, so actually identifying them first and then trying to fulfill them for the team, but also I think that when we have specialists on the team, it's not just the matter of productivity, that you try to make them focus on their thing and not gonna get distracted by stuff which they are not exactly experts on. It also kind of adds to that basis or sort of the background circumstance which adds to that flow or kind of helps them create it. That they don't have to do things they are not exactly after. And basically, good leaders are those who try to take all that secondary stuff from the plates of their teammates, who are more like focused on their own thing. So I believe in that. So as a good CEO is the one who actually serves the team rather than manages the team.
So I know that it's difficult for some people on the stream to hear what you shared, and it's a very, very, like, I'm being a bit provocative when I say can not be managed. Flow can, I said it should be cannot be managed. It's a bit of a provocation to say that, because I'm inviting us to reflect on the shared responsibility of the person in the team versus the servant leadership, as you described, that is not a leader of leading or managing, it's a leader who's serving the group. And then in that case, they're serving the flow of the group. And of course they can do things, but it's a two-way road, because if there's no communication from the person about their flow, and in particular their needs for flow, it's very hard to serve them. I'll give you an example. I was running a workshop in Allianz in Germany. So you have all these very, very German engineers profiles who are working, and they're trying to do a design thinking workshop where empathy is the key. And they were absolutely not in the flow. But they did not actually want to tell that they were not in the flow, because they didn't want to lose face with their colleagues. So they were all like putting their post-its in flow, because they were like, yeah, I'm in flow. And you could see that they were not in the flow. So they didn't have the psychological safety to express the real need that they had with flow. And therefore, as a leader, even as a servant leader, even as a good CEO, you're not going to do very much if they're not willing to actually express honestly what their needs are on flow. So it's a two-way road. Even though you have a great leader, you still need people to actually bring forth what they're experiencing and needing.
Well, there's a flip side to that. When you've worked with people for quite some time, you already know them, and maybe they don't say it, but you already know that, okay, this guy doesn't like when you do specific things, so you try not to do that thing ever. Or actually, if something is coming actually his way or her way, but you know that that's gonna drag them out of that flow, you might want to try to intercept that, or kind of put it in a on a shelf for a moment and get back to it when it's a better moment for them. Something like
Exactly. So, any other questions? Any other observations? Yeah. Shall I pass the mic? Maybe.
I was just about to
Is
say
it?
that
Is it?
let's
Is
try
it?
that, yeah. If that's on the PowerPoint.
Slide in.
Yeah.
Then at least everybody can hear.
Thank you. I was just about to ask, would you have any advice relating to the whole feedback part in terms of, like, let's say there's a hypothetical scenario where you are the only, like, you don't really have those kinds of people around you with those same expertise to give that kind of feedback and praise for the thing you're working on. So, like, what to do in that kind of situation to sort of regain that flow.
So why is that specifically an issue that they're not in the same expertise?
Because they just do not have that same experience in the field. Like, they do not quite understand the exact, like, pipeline of how things work and what you exactly are doing. So, like, I'm just wondering where to then find that kind of feedback in that kind of a situation where you are the only one who understands within the team what is, like, what your job has to do with.
Thank you. I think this is actually where Dimitri comes in, because what
I think it's about authority, if I guess it right, sort of.
I feel like it's about authority. And for example, if my programmer or my artist does something and like looks for that kind of feedback, for example, in Slack, they bring something there, and it's kind of expected that we should say something. I mean, others. And even though I'm not an artist, even though I'm not a programmer, there's always an angle I can use that to kind of lift it a bit for the person, and just like give me a thumbs up, even though they understand I'm not on their level, to really properly assess the level of effort of what they have achieved. It's still like miraculously gets them higher in that sense. But of course, the more authority you can get, the better. And maybe the question is, what if you don't have any proper authority to give an advice or to give an opinion which would matter for the person? What to do in that situation?
So there's multiple layers of question. Let's tackle that in two scenarios. One is on a systemic level. A company can try and create a new habit for everybody, which is to talk about process and flow. Most companies don't. Most companies talk about the content of their work, the game, the deadline, what's in the game. But the habit, and you know the power of habits, when you do tiny habits again and again, it makes a huge change in culture. So on a company level, what you're describing can be solved by having a habit that big conversations, important projects always have a flow check-in. And everybody does it. So then that authority problem disappears because everybody's doing it, not just one person when they need it. On an individual level, if there's a question of authority, which is then back to what you were saying, is that remember that feedback is very hard. The biggest conflicts I've seen come from people giving the best intention feedback. People think, oh, I'm being kind, I'm giving you feedback. Actually, what they're doing is they're literally killing the person with something that is going to be difficult for them for months. So out of that, if you're needing flow, but you're not being heard, then it's just a question of personal authority, which can be hacked by, how to explain being green, being empathic about what others might be thinking of you. Let me give you an example. If I'm the only developer in a team of designers, and they're all UX designers, they're trained in art, and they have no idea how to code in Python, and I'm the only Python person, I can say something like, you designers over there, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. Smile, they'll probably laugh. That's the basis of comedy, by the way, is talking about others. And then talking about how they might see you and how they may misunderstand you with regards to flow. You probably think that I'm the same today as I was yesterday, but yesterday I was in the flow today and I'm upset, but you can't tell the difference. And then they'll go, okay, so what? Well, I need, and then you share your flow need. You say, I need more time, I need more clarity on my goals, I need a better deadline, I need these skills, and I need these tools so that I can reach flow. So it's no longer about you versus them. It's no longer a personal conversation. It's a conversation about the collective workflow. And then that makes it really a lot easier to bring authority, because it's not about you versus them. It's about your needs to perform as a team. It's a difficult question, and I've done entire workshops on the question of authority. So it's a big topic, but you can do that on an individual and a collective level. Yes.
Is hyperfocus and flow different thing, or are they the same thing?
Hyperfocus is a component, and it's not always part of flow. So they're different, definitely different. Hyperfocus can be not motivating. It can be very obsessive and manic, and it can be very, very tiring, actually. It can also be part of how people experience flow. So they're connected, but they're not the same. Did you have a particular case in mind that you wanted to sort of investigate on that? No. Oh, are you able to shout?
I have a short one.
Yeah.
How often would you recommend tracking your flow, and do you have any tools that you recommend using for that, or are mostly self-taught?
So you're asking is how often and what tools to measure flow? I actually have a type form that I made for my own team, which is this literally what we did earlier as a walkthrough with a type form. I'll share it with you in Slack. It's an open source thing. I've just been doing it for our own. You can test it. You're welcome to use it. I haven't found very many. It's a surprise that there is not much out there to measure flow. In all these HR apps, they mostly focus on sentiment analysis, not on actual flow mechanics, which is a shame. So any game developers who want to gamify workflow in HR, come and talk to me. We'll start a company afterwards. The other question is how often. That depends on the stakes. If I'm doing a creative workshop where it's a highly chance of creativity and the billable hours compiled by the whole team is very high, I'll do 3 a day. Most companies, it's enough to do a flow check-in once a week. For example, when you do your weekly stand-ups, or when you do retros, it's a good idea to just building a bit of like those 3 questions. What's your motivate? If I'm in a difficult conversation with my work team and I sense that temperature's rising, we do a quick pause, have a coffee break. Let's do a flow check-in. What's your need, Jonas? And then it's no longer about I'm feeling bad or feeling good. It's more like right now I need motivation, or I need this is too slow. I need more challenge. And then it helps to quickly fluidify how we adjust our work together. So it can be as often as you need, and more is better. Then I think that's a question that's back on you, in depending on how important it is for you to reach flow. Some people have a very high resilience to not being in the flow. They're quite comfortable being in a bad state and being apathetic all the time. If I think of people in France in workplaces, when I say flow, they look at me with huge eyes and they go, "What do you mean I can actually enjoy work?" And they don't even know it's possible, so they're not going to search for flow. Whereas people in the Nordic countries who are, in workplace, very lucky to have great flow often, they'll actually have a higher so it depends on how your appetite for flow is. It's really cultural as well.
Sometimes it feels like here in Nordic countries it's almost a religion.
Yeah, should I repeat that? So, because I'm basically I was born in a different neck of woods than Nordic countries, and one of the revelations kind of after coming here and working here for quite a while was that how Finns are actually obsessed about finding this right thing for them to do in their life. And I think the big part of it is actually that flow. They just don't know how to express that when they try to explain that I want my thing, which I'm good at. But it's because it builds that, and it is almost religion here. Yeah, and I can kind of envy even Finns for that.
And I'll just add to what you said that the risk is that once you know that flow is possible, that people start to expect it all the time, and when they're not in the flow, they start going, "I'm not going to do this deadline because I don't reach flow." It can also be counterproductive. So just take this with a pinch of salt, know how to get into the flow, but it doesn't mean that you're always going to be able to. And in some cultures, it's not even an impossible concept to talk about as such.
Thank you. Just as a kind of reminder that we're soon running out of time for this discussion. So any last question, perhaps like one or two? Perhaps we take from someone who hasn't asked already. So, Juho.
So, how do I bring that up for higher ups? That if I tell them that my flow will go up if my paycheck goes up. So, how do you approach this in a workplace?
It's a nice trick question. It's like you've kind of already answered your question. No, I think seriously, a bigger topic is those of you who intend to create a company as entrepreneurs or as leaders. If you don't build the ideas behind flow into your company, then essentially the people who are employees of that company are not going to often have the legitimacy to ask for flow, because it's like if you go to some companies and you talk about flow, they'll laugh you out the room. They'll say, what do you mean flow? I'm paying you to be productive. Get out of my hair. And then there's no conversation about flow. So it's really down to what's your company culture, which invites you to perhaps think about when you choose your company culture, either by building it or where you choose to work, maybe you can actually ask them, how do they manage flow in their workplace?
Okay. Perhaps I will close with an anecdote. Estève and I, we've been working together many times since 2016, I believe. And one of the big revelations that I've had personally in the discussions that we've had and the experiencing flow at work is about, and this gets kind of difficult in terms of language, when we talk about a perceived challenge of a challenge, perhaps better to use task. So you are given a task and then you evaluate that challenge. How good am I, or how big does it feel? And the big thing for me is to really identify the task right, so that I'm actually kind of connected to the feeling of challenge of that particular task that I'm giving. Sounds probably kind of mixed or confusing, but I will give you an example. I'm a manager of operations in our company, which basically means that when circumstances change, I need to somehow bring these changing circumstances into somehow manageable tasks that are easy to understand for the team members to execute. And this kind of executive state of mind, when you first see that, okay, there's a big thing that I need to take care of. For example, very vague goal. We need to deliver a game. It's like huge. It goes into million different small subtasks. And actually understanding that if I'm feeling like the challenge that I'm experiencing or perceiving is for the entire thing at once, it's just kind of too much to handle, and it's almost impossible to evaluate my perceived competence about something that big. So really kind of identifying the tasks, finding connecting that what you are perceiving and what you are feeling are the same thing. So that has been very important, because if you're not connecting those, then you're not measuring your flow correctly, and then none of this helps. So just kind of saying that it's very important to really be able to piece down the tasks into something manageable and then analyze those, rather than some huge abstract entities in that sense. Any last words from you?
I'll just leave you with a thought of how you might hack your flow in your conversations, because you're thinking of teamwork as being working together, making decisions, but the decision is just the end of a longer process called a conversation or relationship. So maybe reflecting on how you can use flow to reach flow even in difficult, creative or conflictual conversations, and come and ask me questions if you have any on that afterwards. I'll happily open those topics up, because that's basically my core at the moment, is looking at how to reach flow in particularly creative and conflictual conversations. I'm a conflict mediator at the moment, so, and it's possible even in Finland when we don't like conflicts to reach flow during a conflict. So that's the leaving thought, is how might you reach flow in your most difficult conversations? And if you can hack that, you'll probably have better sleep in your career while you're working. Thank you very much, and look forward to meeting you later, some of you, if you want to come and have a chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That will be the end of our broadcast. So thank you for all the online viewers. Hope you enjoyed it and got the most out of it, despite our tech issues. And for the people here, we have some more program incoming. So there will be a game story told with the title "Simplicity is the Ultimate Sophistication," related to a prototype that has been developed lately. So soon more about that. And for the online viewers, have a nice night. Feel free to have coffee, water, whatever. We will take like 5 to 10 minute break, set up everything, and then we can continue.